Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another Q&A video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and we're changing up the format of these just a little bit insofar as our Q&As are now, as an experiment, going to be more thematically focused. We're going to keep all the questions to a single broad topic. Today's topic is British small arms of World War II. So I have 5 pages of questions here submitted by the fine folks on Patreon who help support Forgotten Weapons. If you're interested in sending in a question for what will once again be a monthly Q&A video, head on over to Patreon, subscribe there, and when I'm setting up a Q&A, I will put out a request for questions on Patreon. So, also, today's video is brought to you by the adorable, heavily armed Rockhopper Penguin, that was the outcome of my great yomp in the Falklands. If you'd like to get a patch or a t-shirt with this adorably cute little guy on it, head over to Varstaleka. I have links in the description text below. We have t-shirts and patches with the design. Hopefully they're back in stock now because they were sold out for a while. Anyway, let's get into our first question, which is actually 2 questions that both refer to the 50 caliber Vickers. So Joe asks, why did Britain end up fielding 4 different heavy cartridges during the war, 50 Vickers, 55 Boys, 15mm BESA, and eventually 50 BMG, rather than standardize on a single caliber for their anti-tank rifles and heavy machine guns? And Tony asks, was the 50 caliber Vickers heavy machine gun a good weapon? It never seems to get mentioned. Well, it never really gets mentioned for good reason, because it was never really substantially used. This is a gun that is significant, well, is definitely an independent thing from the regular Vickers Mark I water-cooled heavy machine gun that the British military used in World War I and World War II. The 50 caliber Vickers was developed during the interwar period by the Vickers company as an armament for the armored vehicles that they were also making at that time. So if you're going to go buy a tank from the Vickers company, or Vickers Armstrong, it was going to come with some guns on it, and so Vickers made those guns as well. Now there were a number of tankettes and light tanks that were purchased in limited numbers by the British military that did use the 50 cal Vickers. It was not that uncommon to have a twin gun turret on one of these things where one gun was a 303 Vickers and one gun was a 50 caliber Vickers. So you sort of had differential armament for different things you might be shooting at. The 50 cal is good for other light skinned vehicles. The 303 is better for infantry. Now, the British never adopted very many of these. The big problem with the 50 cal Vickers from an armored vehicle perspective is that it's a water-cooled gun, which means it has to have a water jacket, and that water jacket is something that's prone to damage, and coming up with ways to either recirculate water inside an armored vehicle or be able to refill the water jacket inside the vehicle if you shoot enough to boil the water off. These things are really complicated. They tried some recirculating systems. They were all fragile. They all had issues of, like, where do you put the water tank? Because the turret has to rotate. So either you have a whole bunch of long flexible lines so that there can be a tank of water and a recirculating pump somewhere down in the hull that remains tied to the gun jacket, or you have to mount all of that stuff on the turret so it's fixed in place and rotates with the gun. But now you're using up what is valuable real estate inside the turret. Really much better to have an air-cooled gun as a tank secondary armament, which incidentally is why the BESA was adopted, and we'll get to the BESA later on. But that's part of the thing. The 50 cal Vickers was never developed as an infantry heavy machine gun. It was developed as an armored vehicle weapon, and there was really never a need for it as an infantry weapon. 50 caliber machine guns, the ammunition is way heavier, way bulkier, way larger. The guns themselves are larger than 30 caliber guns. They have a place for anti-tank early in the interwar period and anti-aircraft use, but they're not really that suitable as a standard infantry support weapon. Which is why, I mean, the US is really an outlier in having so many 50 caliber machine guns during World War II, and it's largely as a result of the US planning to use them as anti-aircraft weaponry on everything that could possibly have a 50 caliber M2 mounted to it. Yes, they got used in an infantry role as well. So did Dishkas in the Red Army. But in general, there wasn't a large need to replace the 303 Vickers with a 50 caliber Vickers for the British Army. So it wasn't. Now, the main place that the 50 cal Vickers actually got used was in naval mounts. There were multiple gun, 2 and 4 gun mounts that were used as anti-aircraft mounts on ships, where it's a lot easier to have a water-cooled gun on a ship. There is pretty much always a reliable supply of water around. You don't have to worry about the weight of the gun or its mounts or anything like that. It's on a ship, kind of, for a gun like that, it doesn't matter what it weighs. And so that's the primary place where 50 cal Vickers got used. Now, you don't really have to worry about the supply logistics of combining 55 caliber boys anti-tank ammo for guys in the Army and 50 cal Vickers ammo for naval ships. It was never really a big issue. And the same thing pretty much applies to the 15 millimeter BESA. This was also an armored vehicle weapon, and it's really, it's a little more towards the light cannon side, and again, not a gun that was going to be adopted for general purpose infantry use. The British Armored Corps had their own logistics supply system already that was kind of independent from the infantry, and supplying them specialized ammunition for the armored vehicles wasn't really that big of a deal logistically. So there was never really an incentive to combine these cartridges down to a single standard cartridge. The 50 Vickers would have potentially had some issues trying to be adapted to 55 boys, which had a big rebated rim on, or a big belted rim on it. The 55 boys ammunition was substantially more powerful than 50 Vickers. 50 Vickers is actually noticeably shorter and less powerful than 50 Browning, and wouldn't have made a particularly good anti-tank round. You wanted as much velocity as you could get on an anti-tank round, hence the 55 boys. And then 50 BMG really only comes into the picture once the British are getting the guns from the US, because the US has scaled up production to just ungodly levels during the war. So most of these other 50 caliber developments are done in the 30s. The 50 Browning for the British shows up in the middle of the war. This is basically why there was never a consolidation of cartridges. Development took place at different times, and there was not that much push to combine them. A little more specifically on the point for Tony's question, was the 50 Vickers a good gun? It was a perfectly adequate gun, but it wasn't a gun that served a significantly necessary role. All right, moving on. Oliver says, the Sten was adopted as an emergency measure to make some full auto viable to infantry squads. Yeah, that's a fair enough assessment of it. Were the Brits aware of the problems with its single feed magazine, and did they give any consideration to modifying the design to dual feed? I know this ended up with the PIAT or Sterling, but would it have been possible during the war? In theory possible, but I don't think justified during the war. So the Sten was developed in ludicrously short time. And the Sten was initially developed as a simplification of the Lanchester. And the Lanchester is a literal, just straight up copy of the Bergmann or Schmeisser MP28-2. I guess I shouldn't say straight up copy. They did make a couple of modifications to it. But in terms of engineering design, the Lanchester is just, we need a submachine gun now. We've got that MP28-2, copy it, make more of them. Redesigning magazines is one of the, surprisingly to some people, maybe the non-intuitively fairly complicated, if not most complicated, aspects of developing a new firearm. So the idea that we'll just change the magazine to dual feed, there's a lot more to it than just, oh, we'll make it dual feed. You have to redesign the bolt, you have to redesign the magazine, you have to retolerance the magazine. It is far, far simpler to take a known functional thing, even if it does have some theoretical and occasionally real problems. Single feed has its pros and cons. Single feed is easier to design the gun around. The cartridge is always in the exact same place when it's feeding, instead of alternating between left and right of the magazine. So I think it absolutely made sense for the British to stick with the single feed Schmeisser magazine for the Lanchester, and by extension for the Sten gun. Yes, there are downsides to those magazines, but they're not huge ones. It's not like Sten magazines don't work. It's just that they are prone to issues that you don't get in double feed magazines. But but that doesn't mean there aren't also downsides to double feed magazines, and having to design a new double feed magazine is a really significant downside compared to the option of just take an existing known functional single feed magazine that's been in production for almost 20 years at this point. The MP18 or the MP28 magazine was taken from the updated MP18 magazines. Like, it was, by 1920, that magazine was developed and in production and good to go. So yeah, could they have changed it? Possibly, but it really would have been counterproductive to the goal of getting as many guns into production and into service as quickly as possible. All right, now we have two questions on the Owen gun. Technically not British, but Commonwealth, we'll go with it. Northern Relish says, with how much better the Owen gun is in terms of reliability while still being cheap to manufacture compared to the Sten, why didn't the British start making or using Owens instead of Stens? Or at least, why didn't Owens see wider use on other fronts? And Ed says, not really British, but Commonwealth. One of the books I have says the Germans somehow came across Owen guns and designated them as the MP752E. Were Owen guns used in the European or North African theaters? And if they were, why didn't they just, why not use them instead of Thompsons? All right, so the Owen gun took a while to get into production. And to start with Ed's question, the Owen was not used in North Africa or really in Europe at all. And the major reason is it took time to get them into production. The Australian military activity in the European theater was early in the war. The Owen gun wasn't really in production until the spring of 1943, and that's about the time that the Australians become much more focused on the Pacific theater. And Owen guns got shipped to the Pacific theater for use. So the British did test an Owen gun. They tested it in December of 43, which is right at the time that they're testing and developing the Mark V Sten. Now, I didn't find a specific reference to it, although I didn't look super hard. I suspect the British had the early versions, the prototypes of the Mark V Sten available alongside their testing of the Owen gun and looked at it and went, the differences between these two are not substantial enough to justify changing up the production that we already have. The British had millions, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Sten guns already produced and in service. They have the magazines, they have the training, they have the armor supplies, they have all the infrastructure for manufacture and repair of the Sten gun. The Owen is not nearly as cheap to manufacture as a Sten, not by a long shot. It's definitely a better submachine gun, but the Sten was proving itself pretty adequate, and the Mark V Sten was intended to resolve a lot of the ergonomic issues that you had with earlier with the Mark IIs and Mark IIIs. It's got a wooden buttstock, it's got a pistol grip on it. It's going to be a lot more comparable to an Owen gun in terms of handling, and so it doesn't surprise me that the British didn't opt to scrap all of the development they'd put into the Sten to switch over to this Australian thing out of the Commonwealth that they didn't make all that many of. Who knows what problems you'd have trying to scale up Owen gun production from a few tens of thousands to millions. So, yeah, Owen's better. Sten makes more sense for the British in December 43, January of 44, that time period. As for German use of it, the Germans gave designations to like everything that anybody else developed at any time. There are German designations for things like the RSC 1917, and this is a World War II designation for a World War I gun. There's a German designation for the RSC 1918 that never really saw combat service. So doesn't surprise me at all, shouldn't surprise anyone at all, that the Germans had a designation for the Owen gun. However, the Germans never got their hands on any significant quantity of Owens because they just weren't ever really used fighting the Germans. In addition, by the time the Owen was in use, had it gone to Europe, the Germans still wouldn't really have gotten their hands on significant numbers, because the only time that you capture enemy weapons is when you're making significant advances, capturing territory, overrunning enemy troops and enemy supply depots, and getting a lot of their stuff. And by 44, the Germans aren't doing a lot of that. We have an example at Battle of the Bulge, but that's kind of it. They wouldn't have had the opportunity to get the Owen even if it had been in Europe in 44. Next question is from Slacker, who says, were there any examples of an assault rifle type weapon developed by the UK during or prior to World War II? This is an easy one because the answer is no. The British were not particularly interested in a self-loading or fully automatic, like they weren't at all interested in a full auto infantry rifle before World War II, and they weren't really even that interested in a self-loading rifle before World War II. I actually did a Q&A video about 5 years ago where someone asked a similar question, and I passed it along to Jonathan Ferguson at the British Royal Armouries, and he gave a really good answer describing all the stuff that the British did test and what they thought of it during the interwar period, mostly during the early and mid 30s. So I will link in the description text below to his answer from that Q&A, which you may be interested to take a look at. But no, absolutely no interest in intermediate cartridge development in the British Empire before World War II. Along these same lines, we have a question from Yao, I think, sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce that best. It says, why did the UK not have a semi-auto rifle in World War II? Was it because there was a huge number of Enfields available, or did the Brits wake up late to that need? If possible, same question applies to the Germans. The Germans actually did some development of self-loading rifles during the interwar period. Not a lot, but a little bit. The biggest thing for the Germans, I think, was that they had a lot of different areas that they wanted to rebuild in short order. They didn't have a ton of money to do it with, and an infantry rifle just wasn't top priority for them. Now, it became a priority, and they developed several self-loading rifles within the first couple years of the war. For the British, the situation was a little different. You could say, yeah, they just woke up late to that need. It wasn't until like 1943 that the British military really did actually set out an intention to develop a self-loading rifle. But even at that point, it wasn't something they were going to try to do during the war. It was more like, all right, everybody else has a semi-automatic rifle now. I guess we have to do it. So when the war's over, we'll figure out how to do that, and it'll be an 8mm Mauser, interestingly. Again, the segment that I linked to in the description text from Jonathan, talking about what the British did try during the interwar period, is relevant here. Check that out. Beyond that, really, the thing is, the British had an infantry doctrine that was based around the firepower of the Bren light machine gun. And the Bren was a fantastic gun, extremely reliable, very, very good. And they just, I think, didn't see the requirement to change up that doctrine. And as long as they have that doctrine, they didn't see a self-loading rifle as particularly important. The role of the rifleman was as much to carry ammunition for the Bren as it was to actually shoot anybody at all. It's worth pointing out, British standard infantry layout, the riflemen carried more ammunition for the Bren than they carried for their own rifles. Yeah, it's the same caliber ammo, but they had more ammo in Bren gun magazines than they had in Lee Enfield stripper clips. So, yeah, there just legitimately was not an interest, a push to develop this sort of weapon during the interwar period. Next question is from Dalbunaski, who says, the EM2's magazine, all right, this is a little post-World War II, but we'll allow it. The magazine has an auto bolt closing feature that you don't see anywhere else, as far as I know. Do you ever see it coming back? So yeah, the EM2 magazine, the gun locks open when the mag's empty, pull the mag out. When you insert a loaded magazine, it automatically closes the bolt. Very cool on paper, really kind of a pain in the butt to deal with in reality. Those sorts of systems, the EM2 is not the only place they've been done. They are fairly rare. The problem is they are overly complicated. They present a lot of small little bits in the gun that are easy to break or to foul and not work properly. And they just aren't as useful in reality as they sound like they should be on paper. So one thing is the idea of like a one reload, one maximum speed drill isn't really that practical, isn't really that important to unit military operations. If your rifle is not firing for an additional 1 second because you have to hit a bolt release or pull the charging handle back to release it, you're not, this isn't like a, you know, Wild West, middle of Main Street at high noon duel. There are typically other people around. You're typically not standing way out in the open where your life depends on the, you know, the tenths of a second it takes you to reload for that next shot. It is a thing that's becomes very highly regarded in competitive circles, but I think its competition use is far exaggerated compared to its real world use. And when you combine that with the downsides of complexity and like those sorts of systems make it awkward to dry handle a gun, to do drills with it, to sometimes to disassemble it. They just don't work as well in practice as you think they would on paper. And so no, I think those systems will periodically resurface as people who haven't had the experience with them realize, like, hey, I just thought of this really cool thing. Let's have it automatically close the bolt for you when you load a full magazine. And then they'll put it into a developmental design idea, and they'll do some prototypes, and they'll do some testing, and then people go, oh, this actually doesn't work all that well. How could we possibly have known? And it'll get scrapped, and it'll come back up again in another couple decades. But will it ever get into serious actual use? I very much doubt it. Yiri says, in addition to weapons of their own production, new and historical, and weapons supplied from the US, did British troops ever use or adopt weapons from other allies, like the Soviet or French, for routine use, or to a greater extent captured weapons, German, Italian, Japanese, etc.? So first half of this question, as far as I know, they did not use Soviet or French small arms. And the reason is those things just weren't available. The French, of course, are not in a position to be supplying weapons to the British. The French are themselves dependent on British and American small arms supplies to equip the Free French forces mid and late in the war. All of the French arsenals are taken over by the Germans and shut down. There's no excess production. The weapons that the French do have when they signed an armistice with the Germans all go to the Germans. So no, the British are not using French small arms. Soviet small arms, similarly, are not really available. Early in the war, when the British were really in need of additional small arms, well, the Soviets were too, and they didn't have anything really to spare. By the time the Soviets have massive, massive production going, well, then by that point, the British have a lot of production of their own going, especially things like the Sten guns. They have Commonwealth production spooled up. They're able to get rifles being produced in some of the other Commonwealth countries, and they have supplies available from the United States. Soviet stuff is all going to be in calibers that are not being produced by either the British themselves or by the Americans. They're going to be in 7.62 Tokarev, 7.62 by 54 rimmed. British are not going to be using Russian equipment either. As far as captured equipment, in general, not so much. There was use of captured German ammunition and Italian ammunition, 9mm stuff. There's use of captured enemy artillery. I think most of the British use of captured enemy weapons is very much an in-the-moment thing. If we are in active combat, we take this position and it's got a useful weapon that our little group of troops here don't have at the moment. Perhaps we can grab an MP40, or perhaps we take a machine gun nest and, hey, we have a German MG42 and we need to lay down some fire with it right here. We'll use it. But at a more organizational level, use of captured enemy arms is pretty rare, especially for the British. Nick says, why was the PIAT regulated as a destructive device? And more importantly, why has it recently been deregulated as such by the ATF? One sold at Morphy's last year as a curio and relic rifle. So I called up John Keane at Morphy Auctions to ask him about this, he being the person who would definitely know about it. And the PIAT was early on originally regulated as a destructive device under the NFA. And then it got deregulated, and then it got relisted, and then it got re-unlisted. So it's gone back and forth twice. As of this filming, the PIAT is not considered a destructive device under the NFA, and it shouldn't be. Technically speaking, a destructive device is either a projectile that has explosives in it, which would apply to PIAT ammunition, but not to the launcher itself, or a weapon that has a bore over a ½ inch in diameter, with exceptions for shotguns. Now, the PIAT doesn't have a bore. It's a spigot mortar. So it shouldn't qualify as a destructive device at all. It's worth pointing out that there are some other things like M79 grenade launchers. If you take the barrel off of an M79 and you just have an M79 action, that's not a destructive device. When you put a barrel on it, it is, but without a barrel, it doesn't have a bore diameter over 50 caliber because it doesn't have a bore. Apparently, what ATF used as its justification for a while is that there is, in fact, a circular cartridge guard at the front of the PIAT that protects, if you have a shell loaded, there's this, it's only like a ½ inch wide. There's this little steel strap over the very front of the shell cradle that protects the round in case something hits the gun or you drop the PIAT. You're not going to bang the high explosive warhead on the ground. You're going to hit this protective ring. That ring ATF was considering as the muzzle of the weapon. And sure enough, that is bigger than 50 cal. It's probably 3 inches in diameter. That is, however, a really dumb interpretation. That thing is not a bore. There's no bore on the gun. One has to wonder, given that the technical requirement for deactivating a destructive device is to drill a hole in the barrel that is the diameter of the bore, what exactly are you drilling a hole in the PIAT? Anyway, like I said, it went back and forth a couple times, and as of current filming, it is correctly not regulated as a destructive device. And thanks to Morpheus, by the way, for pushing that. I don't think they were the ones who did it the first time, but I believe they are responsible for it being deregulated this most recent time. Nick also has a second question here. I've heard you say before that the Bren is the best light machine gun of World War II. I've always wondered how and why it would compare favorably to the Degtyarev, which is about the same weight, enjoys a substantial capacity advantage as well as a profile advantage from the ground, less target indicator with no mag reaching up into the sky. So lay it out. Why is the Bren better? The biggest single benefit the Bren gun has over the Degtyarev is those magazines. They may be 2/3 the capacity, 30 rounds instead of 47, but they are far easier to carry. Pan magazines are a pain in the butt. I recently actually had a video on pan magazine carrying options. None of them were particularly good during World War II. They are awkward. Carrying the gun with a pan magazine on it is even awkward because stuff's just sticking out in weird directions. In addition, I would say the bipod on the Bren is better. It locks in place, which the Degtyarev bipod does not. And the Degtyarev that was used for most of World War II, the original DP, has a traditional stock with a grip safety on it, which to my mind, it sucks. It's really awkward, to me at least, to shoot. The pistol grip on the Bren gun is much better. So minor advantages to the Bren gun in terms, well, say a minor advantage in the bipod, moderate advantage in the handling because of that pistol grip and buttstock design, and a significant advantage in magazine carrying capacity, magazine handling. All right, we now have a series of submachine gun questions. So Grumpy Conquistador has a question here that we kind of went over already, but essentially, given that the US was a major industrial and logistics supplier for the UK during World War II, was it really worth it to design the Sten in 9mm rather than 45? His point being, is magazine design important enough to outweigh the logistics of having to supply 2 different subgun ammunition types for the Thompson and the Sten? So you make a good point that I think a lot of people may not have even considered. The British first acquisition of submachine guns was the Thompson gun in 45, and they ended up buying hundreds of thousands of Thompson guns from the US between the early cash and carry and later lend-lease deliveries. But I don't think the British ever anticipated that that was a long-term solution. Their long-term solution was domestic production of submachine guns, and it made sense to put those in 9mm because they had to get them up and running as quickly as possible, and redesigning the MP28 for 45 caliber would have been a significant engineering challenge. Not just the magazine, but now you have to redesign the whole gun and the magazine. I don't think that makes sense. If redesigning it for a double stack magazine in 9mm is too much to ask, redesigning the whole gun for 45 definitely is. The British weren't producing 45 or 9mm of their own at that point anyway. They're going to have to make the ammo. You might as well design the Sten gun, keep the Sten gun in 9mm, and start producing domestic 9mm ammo. They did also, by the way, purchase 9mm ammo from the US, at least at first, alongside the 45 ammo that they purchased from the US. Cameron says, drawing on the Sten and the M3 grease gun, both being weapons designed to be easier and cheaper to produce than the SMGs otherwise in service, which one was actually easier and cheaper? Did the British and Commonwealth ever receive grease guns on Lend-Lease, and did they like them? No, they didn't ever receive any significant numbers of grease guns through the Lend-Lease program. The scaling down of the Thompson was really the end of British 45 caliber submachine gun acquisition. There's actually still some debate back and forth over whether the British got any substantial number of M1 Thompsons, the simplified Thompson guns. And it appears they did get some, but the vast majority of British Thompson guns were 1928s, 1928 A1s. So by the time the grease gun was coming into production, the British had the Sten gun. And frankly, they were like on the road to the Mark V, the really nice Sten gun. They had hundreds of thousands of them already in service, the Mark IIs and Mark IIIs. And at that point, it doesn't make sense to move to another 45 caliber gun that uses a different magazine, all different infrastructure. Better at that point to focus on the Sten gun. It's being produced in large enough numbers that Lend-Lease of something to supplement the Sten isn't really necessary at that point. Continuing the submachine guns, JF says, relating to the Sten gun, if this hadn't been so hastily deployed, do you think there would have been an effort to develop a submachine gun in 455 auto? No, definitely not. So first off, I mean, 455 auto is a terrible cartridge for box magazines, for submachine guns, especially large capacity box magazines. More importantly, though, 455 auto wasn't in use by the British by the time of World War II. Their pistols were now Webleys and Enfields like that, chambered for 38-200, which rimmed cartridge, underpowered cartridge, not good for submachine guns, and also a cartridge that they never attempted to develop for submachine guns. With the exception maybe of an experimental Owen, possibly, but there were a couple Owen. In fact, I think the Owen actually they did try in 455, and it was not a success. Made much more effective in 9mm Parabellum. And one more in this series from Nick, accounting for machine hours, quality, and other factors, which is the better SMG for the British in World War II, the Lanchester or the Sten? I'm going to go with absolutely the Sten. The Lanchester is a fancier gun, but it's got a lot of downsides. So the Lanchester is heavy. It's really heavy. It's heavier than a Lee Enfield rifle. It is not only heavy, but poorly balanced. It is way front heavy. There's a ton of steel and brass or bronze on the front end of a Lanchester. The Lanchester magazine is not great. 50 rounds is frankly too much for a single feed submachine gun magazine like that. I think a lot of British troops who eventually got their hands on Lanchester mags discovered that, like, oh, maybe we're actually better with those 32-round Sten mags. They're 50 rounders are a little sketchy. And the Lanchester cost 5 times as much as standard production Sten. So even like for me, if you gave me the option of the two, given that I'm left-handed, I would probably take a Lanchester over a Sten Mark II. But my requirements are a little different than the overall logistical considerations for the British military. And I would take a Sten Mark V over a Lanchester. So Leon says, in regards to the EM1 and EM2 series of rifles, were there plans for a heavier designated support version? Did it have an equivalent, if even on paper, to like the L86? And the answer there is no. There was an EM1 Corsac that was developed that was essentially a British bullpup take on the FG-42. It's a fascinatingly interesting weapon, and it was sort of a light support weapon design. It had a bipod, but still used 20-round mags, not a particularly heavy barrel on it. It went nowhere. It was very much just a prototype. The plan was, if the EM2 had been adopted as the service rifle, the support weapon was going to be the Bren gun rechambered for 280. That was the plan. So there was no bullpup support weapon version of the EM2. It was, we have this good support weapon, we're going to keep using it, and just rechamber it for the new cartridge. Next up, Matthew Smith says, why did the Royal Armor Corps use BESA machine guns given they were chambered for 8mm Mauser instead of something else in 303? And the answer is because They needed an air-cooled gun. In like 1938, it was pretty clear that war was pretty imminent. They needed something now. The BESA was available. This was actually the Czech ZB-37 machine gun. It was available. The British bought a license to manufacture it themselves and didn't feel that they had the time to re-engineer the gun to a rimmed cartridge like 303. And because the Armored Corps had, as I previously alluded to, sort of already an independent logistics setup, it wasn't that big a deal to supply different ammunition to the armored vehicles than to the infantry. And everyone kind of knew 8mm Mauser was a really good cartridge. It was a better cartridge, technically speaking, than 303. The reason the British still had 303 was legacy. They picked up the 303 back in the 1880s, and it just never quite made sense to replace it en masse. But when you have the conundrum of, we don't want to have this water-cooled Vickers because of the issues with water cooling, we need an air-cooled gun. Okay, we found this one, the Czechs developed it, it's really good, but time is of the essence. Just use it in 8mm and we'll deal with the supply issues. That's essentially it. This is also an explanation of why later in the war the British started using American tanks with 30-06 caliber Browning machine guns. Again, not that big a deal to supply different ammunition to the Armored Corps, but they never replaced the Vickers guns with Brownings for infantry service because there the ammunition logistics is much more of an issue. Next up, Alan. Sorry about my voice here, guys. I'm in recovery from a heavy bout of cold or flu, and voice is starting to drag a little bit. We'll keep going as long as I can, though. Alan says, given the benefit of hindsight, what was the biggest missed chance of British small arms of World War II? Weapons or technologies or procurement ideas from the interwar period that were almost adopted but scrapped. I don't know that there are a whole lot of projects that like came close but not quite there. I think the biggest missed opportunities for the British were the lack of interest in developing a couple of weapons systems during the interwar period that they could have actually put to good use. And perhaps the best one is submachine guns. The British had every opportunity to develop and adopt a submachine gun during the interwar period, and they just chose not to because they didn't think the concept had much validity. And so instead, when the war starts and they start watching Germans running around with MP38s being really effective and go, oh crap, we need some of those, those stupid gangster guns. Well, they have to spend a tremendous amount of very valuable hard currency buying Thompsons from the United States before Lend-Lease kicks in. There could have been much better uses for that gold bullion, that hard currency, than buying massively overpriced Thompson submachine guns from Russell McGuire and the Auto Ordnance Company. And it would, there were so many submachine guns out there, it would have been extremely easy. There were no technical obstacles to developing a submachine gun in the 1930s and adopting it. The second one would be a self-loading infantry rifle, but as we already talked about, British infantry doctrine didn't really require it, didn't really make good use of it. It's perhaps a missed opportunity to revise some of that infantry doctrine to develop a self-loading rifle and then make good use of it. That would have required a lot more development. There would have been a lot more risk involved in that process during the interwar period. And as we see, the British ended up doing pretty well with their Bren guns, Vickers guns, and Lee Enfields. Mark Ovett asks for a brief discussion on small arms in British naval service during the war, especially highlighting any differences they had over the land and paratrooper arms in common use. The one gun that's really kind of distinctive to British naval use in World War II, well, there are two. One we already talked about, and that's the 50 caliber Vickers, which I don't know that I would call it really significant in naval use, but essentially only used by the Navy and used well. It was effective. I wouldn't go so far as to say it was particularly more effective than anything else that was out there. There were a lot of other machine guns, light cannons, in that 30, 50, 60 caliber range. For anti-aircraft use 20mm stuff. There were a lot of options. There were a lot of good options. The 50 cal Vickers wasn't a standout as the best of any of them. They were certainly more expensive than a lot of other options. but they worked fine. They were effective, they were usable. The other gun that was specifically naval in use was actually the Lanchester submachine gun, as previously discussed a bit. Originally, the British have a threefold plan for getting submachine guns. The Army just goes out and buys Thompsons, and that's their initial supply of submachine guns. They also want to start domestic production of something, that is the Lanchester, copying the MP-28. And because the Army was happy with Thompsons at the very beginning, the Lanchester was earmarked for the RAF and the Navy, but ended up going almost entirely to the Navy. The RAF actually was planning to use Smith & Wesson 1940 light rifles as something for airfield defense. Those guns ended up being unusably bad, and in fact were not put into active use. But the Air Force ended up getting other stuff, and the Lanchesters essentially all went to the Navy. So the Navy is the service that specifically is responsible for the Lanchester having a 50-round mag. The Navy wanted that. The Navy also wanted bayonets on them. And I think that comes from use with like naval boarding parties, where you're going to potentially be in very close quarters, and having a bayonet does make sense. You know, if you're kicking in doors, bulkhead doors on ships and going into little small compartments, bayonet's worth having on there. Total production of Lanchester during the war was actually pretty small. It's just under 80,000, and I don't know that many of them actually saw very much combat use because they were on ships. And it's important to have the guns, but they don't actually get used all that often. And was there anything special that the Lanchester did that other submachine guns wouldn't have? No, not really. They're better set up with a bayonet than the Sten. Thompsons didn't have bayonets. The Stens just had little pointy sticks on them. But could the Navy have gotten away with any of the other options out there? Yeah, they could have. Pumba's GPA asks, how much of the research on the abortive 280 round was taking place pre-1945? Another quick, easy one, none. The only cartridge that the British showed any real interest in for a self-loading rifle during World War II was actually 8mm Mauser, which they did start some development on. They had the every experimental rifle in the British inventory in the mid-late 40s was the EM something, experimental model blank. They had the EM automatic rifles, EM infantry rifles, EM sniper rifles. So the names are a little bit confusing, but the early pattern of what ended up becoming the FN-49 was developed by Belgian designers who were in exile, essentially, in England during the war. And the British did actually build a small run of SLEM, self-loader experimental model rifles late in World War II that never actually saw combat trials, and they were in 8mm Mauser. The 280 came around after the war. The British look at guns like the Sturmgewehr in 7.92. They look at what do we actually need from an infantry rifle cartridge, and decide on essentially not quite an intermediate cartridge, but a reduced recoil, reduced power cartridge in a smaller diameter. It makes a lot of sense. It doesn't survive the process of negotiating NATO standards with the United States. And here I will transition to a similar question from Paul. Says, because the legendary MP-44 had a major impact in World War II, how does the British military view the MP-44 and what guns they're experimenting with after World War II? The answer is they gave it some consideration. There were a couple of very prototype, very experimental British designs in 8x33 in the immediate aftermath of World War II. But again, they end up deciding they want a single cartridge that they can use in their rifles and support machine guns, the Bren, and that would be the 280. 280 starts as, it's kind of a cartridge like 7.35 Carcano or 6.5 Carcano. It's not 30-06, but it's not that far behind it, and it is definitely not an intermediate, a very small intermediate cartridge like 8x33 Kurtz. So the British see the MP-44, but they don't follow it the way the Russians did. Risto says, can you summarize the open scopes the British used on SMLEs? This is a World War I question, but again, we'll allow it. My friend has some lenses without tubes in his Enfield collection. Do you know any good sources? So first off, no, there are no good sources on what are called basically Gallilean sites. The idea is if you're going to have a telescope, the telescope functions, it's there to hold some lenses in position relative to each other. And you can actually sort of design a rudimentary telescope without the actual tube. You put a lens on the front and a lens on the back of the rifle, and you can get magnification and you can get a reticle that you can zero. And the British did this experimentally during World War I before they got any of their actual proper tube telescope sniper rifles into development, into service. There are 4 or 5 different variations of them. They have low magnification. We're usually talking about like 1.5 power magnification, or even just straight up 1 power unmagnified, but giving you a single focal plane with a reticle that you can put on the target instead of having to align front and rear sights. Skennerton's book on the Lee Enfield is the best source of information I know on these, but it's not very good. It doesn't talk about them very much. There were not many of these actually used. They were fragile. You know, it's real easy to get mud on lenses of a scope like that. They didn't see much use. Extremely cool concept. I've had the chance to actually look at 1 or 2 of them, and they're really interesting, but a really bad idea in a military context. So I wish there was a better source on there. It'd be awesome if someone wrote like the ultimate detailed nerd book on British Gallilean rifle sights, but no one has, and I don't know of anyone who has the information to do it, unfortunately. Landrick says, why was the Sten select fire instead of full auto only? It seems like all of the other war emergency or simplified submachine guns are full auto only, yet the Sten isn't. As a previous owner of a Sten, I found the semi-auto setting to be particularly worthless. My experience was that the Sten didn't benefit in accuracy in semi because of the crude sight's rattle-trap nature and awkward ergonomics. On the other hand, it was slow enough to fire in full auto easily, to easily shoot singles or doubles in full auto if necessary. Seems like an unnecessary complication for the most basic of submachine guns. I definitely agree with you. I think there's no need to have a semi-auto selector on the Sten gun. I haven't found any really good explanation of why it did have it. The best one I've been able to come up with is that the Sten was initially a simplified version of the Lanchester. That was the original concept of like, hey, okay, we're building the Lanchester, but we can make it a lot simpler. The Lanchester had a semi-auto mechanism on it. Interestingly, the Lanchester semi-auto was so complicated and finicky that it was totally unreliable, and they very quickly got rid of it and refurbished early Lanchesters to be full auto only. The Sten trigger, on the other hand, is really simple. It doesn't add that much to it to have that semi-auto functionality, and it works well enough. And I think it was on there initially because they didn't know exactly what they needed. If you look at the Mark I Sten, it has a number of other features that have no place on a super simple submachine gun, like a folding front grip and a not super complicated by submachine gun standards, but the most complex piece on the Mark I Sten is this conical bent sheet metal flash hider that's totally unnecessary. And in retrospect, you'd think, wow, a vertical front grip and a flash hider on a uber simple submachine gun, why would you even put those on there? They're totally useless. Same as the semi-auto feature. Well, they didn't know. And the Sten gun went from design to first production in like 3 months. And so there wasn't time to make everything perfect. This is a situation of perfect is the enemy of good enough. Including the extra time to make a semi-auto selector on the early Sten guns was good enough. Once I think they realized that perhaps this isn't all that useful, well, you don't save that much by getting rid of it. There are going to be some arguable uses for it. And it's reliable, and you know what? We'll just leave it on there because it's already there, and if we change it up, now we have 2 different sets of parts that we have to deal with for all the Sten guns. Easier to stay uniform across all of the Sten variants and just leave the semi-auto on there, even if it's not necessary. Scott says, knowing that British soldiers were armed with, were issued American firearms through Lend-Lease, etc., were American soldiers issued British firearms in World War II, like, say, the Webley Mark VI, or any of the excellent British submachine guns? No. Simple answer, no. The US was supplying the British, not the other way around. Were there instances where American soldiers may have ended up using some British guns out of emergency purposes? Probably, but never on any institutional or organizational level. And I don't think I would say that the British had any excellent submachine guns. The Sten gun was excellent, was an excellent solution to the problem, the requirement that the British had, but I would rather have almost any American submachine gun than a Sten gun. The Sten Mark V is not bad, but the American logistics train is using 45. If we want the cheap one, we've got the grease gun. If we want the expensive one, we've got the Thompson. The US doesn't need Sten guns. Nada says, what was the driving force that led the Lee Enfield action, the Lee action on the Lee Enfield to being adopted over the Mauser action like the Springfield 1903? Easy answer, it's because the Mauser K90, like the Mauser system didn't really exist when the Lee Enfield was adopted. The first Lees were adopted in the 1880s. You don't really get the Mauser action until 1889, and the really excellent Mauser action is the model of 98. Like by 95, it's pretty darn good. 98 is the really good one that people start to copy worldwide. But by that point, the British have had the Lee system, the Lee Enfield, in service for a decade, and they never had, there was never enough rationale for them to change over completely. Oh, okay. Fire Tower says, dollar for pound, what was the better cheap submachine gun, the grease gun or the Sten, for their respective users at the time? I mean, the cop-out answer to this is, for their respective users, the best one was the one that they were officially being issued. But if it were me, honestly, if it were me, I would take a grease gun because I'm left-handed, and it's a more handleable gun. But I think there are a lot of benefits to the Sten gun. 9mm is a better submachine gun cartridge, I think, than 45. The ammo weighs a lot less. Grease guns are actually pretty heavy with full loaded magazines and carrying a bunch of magazines for them. I would say Sten Mark V for most people is probably the best, with the grease gun a very close second, and then Sten 2 and 3 coming in behind the grease gun. That's how I would rate them. All else being equal, assuming you have access to infrastructure, ammunition, etc., and the choice is actually yours, which one to take. All right, unfortunately, my voice is dying here. We have some other good questions that I just wasn't able to get to. I apologize for that. I will do my best to cover more on our next Q&A next month, but we'll end this out with one last question from Cyril, which is, why did not all of the Commonwealth switch to the No. 4 Enfield? Which is a good question. The Australians and the Indians continued to manufacture the No. 1 Mark III SMLE through World War II. In fact, they never did switch to the No. 4 rifle. The reason for this is, essentially the reason is, by the time that they needed rifles, they didn't have enough time to retool the factory to develop the new version. So the No. 4 was developed in the UK during the 1930s and was just barely into production by the time World War II began. And this is in mainland UK. The colonies that are facing imminent military threat, namely Australia, New Zealand, India, as opposed to the Canadians. The Canadians are never under any threat of invasion. The Canadians retool to make the new rifle that the British have. US sources are also tooling up for the new rifle, and these are both brand new production facilities. The Canadians had never produced the No. 3 SMLE, nor had the Americans, and so when contracts go out of, we need to make rifles, find a factory and write them a contract to make these rifles, well, you might as well make the new ones, the best new version, because you're setting up a new factory either way. With India and Australia, the production already existed there, and it was a question of, do we want to take the time to tear down the old production and set up new tooling and get this new model of rifle up and running, or do we just turn on the faucet to manufacture more rifles just like the ones we already have that we know we can make, and we can make faster, a lot faster than changing things up at the beginning of this emergency. And so that's why the Australians continue making number 1 Mark IIIs, and the Indians do as well. The Indians would ultimately, after they get independence in 1947, they go on to make Enfields in 7.62 NATO, but they base them on the number 1 Mark III design. They never do actually get basically the technical data package for the number 4, or if they get it, they never actually put it into production. Same with the Australians. After World War II is over, there really isn't a need for more rifle production in Australia, more Lee Enfield production, and so the Australians would end up keeping their number 1 Mark IIIs until they switch over to L1A1 self-loading rifles, or FALs. Anyway, that's all I've got in my voice for today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you would like to submit a question for next month's Q&A, I don't know what the theme will be yet, but I will post it, the theme and request for questions on Patreon. And that's something that's visible to everyone on Patreon from $2 a month and up. So if you're not a subscriber and you would like to help support Forgotten Weapons, please consider that. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks for watching.